He debated Palestinians for sport, lectured on Zionist history with fire in his voice, quoted Torah and Herzl in the same breath. Dr. Eli Stein was a name in Jerusalem, a Zionist scholar, a man who believed the land was destiny sealed sacred and unquestionable. Until one night, he picked up a Qur'an, not to learn, to criticize, to dissect, to prove it wrong. But then he read one verse, "And we have certainly honored the children of Adam," Surah Al-Isra 17:70. It didn't attack him, didn't argue with him, it honored him, and something cracked. Press 1 if you believe truth can find even those who fight it. Press 2 if you've ever had your worldview shaken by a single line. But whatever you do, don't look away. Because what happened next, even Dr. Stein couldn't debate. Dr. Eli Stein didn't just teach history, he shaped it. His lectures on Zionism at Hebrew University were legendary. He'd pace in front of massive chalkboards, coat half-button tie, loosened eyes blazing. History, he would say, isn't written in ink. It's carved in blood and borders. His students hung on every word. To them, he was a prophet of preservation. To himself, he was a man defending truth. Eli had grown up in Tel Aviv, born to survivors. His father had escaped Poland with nothing but his shoes and a name. His mother had sewn stars onto her sleeves before she ever learned to write. They built a home with hard hands and harder memories. And Eli, he built a mind like a fortress. He devoured Torah. He studied Ben-Gurion and Herzl like scripture. He debated leftists, secularists, and two-staters with the calm ruthlessness of a man who knew. By 45, he had tenure, 3 books, a small but influential circle in the Knesset. His most recent work, The Myth of Neutral Land, had stirred international uproar. CNN called it controversial. The Times of London called it dangerously persuasive. Eli smiled at both. He didn't write to please. He wrote to defend. Then came the conference in Istanbul, ironically titled Interfaith Narratives in the Modern Middle East. He only agreed to attend because of the location, a chance to walk Hagia Sophia, see the Bosphorus. He didn't care for dialogue. He cared for accuracy and for dismantling what he called Palestinian mythology. On the third night during a panel on Abrahamic texts, someone handed him a Qur'an. English Arabic gold embossed fresh from the press. The man, young, polite, wearing a kufi and a quiet smile, said, "Professor Stein, you're welcome to critique us, but at least read the source." Eli almost laughed. He'd skimmed the Qur'an before, enough to mock it in debates, enough to quote it out of context. But something about the kid's confidence, it annoyed him. So he took the book. "I'll read it," he said, for research. That night in his hotel room, he sat at the window. Call to prayer floated through the Istanbul air like perfume. He opened the book. Page 1. "In the name of God, the most gracious, the most merciful." He rolled his eyes. Too poetic. He flipped forward, looked for verses on Jews, on Israel, on war. Then almost at random, his eyes landed on this. "And we have certainly honored the children of Adam," Surah Al-Isra 17:70. He blinked, read it again, "and carried them on the land and sea and provided them with good things and preferred them greatly over much of what we have created." That wasn't an attack. It wasn't propaganda. It was dignity, universal dignity. No categories, no tribes, just children of Adam. He sat back. The Qur'an, this Qur'an, was not written like a manifesto. It wasn't Marx. It wasn't Mein Kampf. It wasn't even like the Torah, full of genealogies and laws. It spoke like a voice, unfiltered, unapologetic, and strangely familiar. He told himself it was just style, just rhetoric. But that one line, it wouldn't leave. "We have honored the children of Adam." He thought about the checkpoints, about the walls, about the young Arab boy he once yelled at for throwing rocks. Was he also a child of Adam? The next day he quoted the verse during the panel, not to praise it, to question it, to say all humanity is honored, interesting, but dangerous, because it ignores the necessity of division. A few people nodded, but the young man from before looked at him, not with anger, but sadness. Eli didn't like that. He didn't want pity. That night he read more. He expected hate, expected political rhetoric. Instead, he found verses on orphans, on patience, on justice even against one's own people, and verses that said things he couldn't argue with. Let not the hatred of a people prevent you from being just. Surah Al-Ma'idah 5:8. He closed the book, paced the room. He wasn't in danger of being convinced. Of course not. He was just curious. That was all. Right Jerusalem greeted him with stone walls and sirens. The familiar tension, the soft hiss of politics behind cafe counters, the way everything was holy and burning at the same time. Eli tried to return to normal. He resumed lectures, signed books, spoke on 2 panels in Tel Aviv about Islamic historiography, but the verse followed him like a shadow. We have certainly honored the children of Adam. It wasn't just the verse, it was the tone. The Qur'an didn't ask for validation. It didn't beg to be believed. It declared, with a certainty Eli had only seen in prophets. Late one night he found himself back in his study. Books lined the walls, Maimonides, Herzl, Golda, Meir Rav Kook, and now, the Qur'an. He pulled it from the shelf like a thief stealing from himself. Sat down. This time he started from the beginning. Surah Al-Fatiha, then Al-Baqarah. This is the book about which there is no doubt, he scoffed, but kept reading. He thought he'd find contradictions. He didn't. He thought he'd find hostility. He didn't. What he found was terrifyingly consistent. He began taking notes, privately, quietly. He opened his Torah beside the Qur'an, compared stories of Adam, of Moses, of Abraham. The Qur'an didn't erase the old stories, it clarified them. It didn't call Bani Israel evil. It reminded him of their responsibility. It wasn't anti-Jew, it was pro-truth. That's what shook him. He wasn't reading propaganda. He was reading scripture, and it sounded like it knew him better than he knew himself. One night around 2 a.m., he read, "Those to whom we gave the book know him as they know their own sons." Surah Al-Baqarah 2:146. He sat up straight. It was talking about the Prophet Muhammad and comparing that recognition to a father knowing his child. He stared at the verse for a long time because he realized he'd spent his life denying someone he never truly studied. The next day he canceled his class, said he had a fever. He didn't. He went to a used bookstore in East Jerusalem, spoke in broken Arabic. "Do you have Hadith?" The storekeeper raised an eyebrow, then smiled. English or Hebrew. Eli left with 4 books, including one titled 40 Hadith Qudsi. That night he opened to a random page and read, "O my servants, even if your sins were to reach the clouds of the sky, then you were to ask forgiveness of me, I would forgive you." Hadith Qudsi. Words not just of the prophet, but of God spoken through him. Eli closed the book slowly and whispered aloud for the first time in years, "Who are you?" He stopped eating with colleagues, stopped going to panels. He said he was revising a manuscript. What he was doing was memorizing Surah Al-Ikhlas. Say he is Allah Wana Waman. He didn't know how to pray, but sometimes late at night he would turn toward what he thought was Mecca and just sit. He didn't speak. He just listened to something inside him, unraveling. One afternoon, a colleague noticed the Qur'an on his desk. "Since when do you read that?" Eli didn't answer. "Careful, Eli. That book's dangerous." He smiled faintly. "Maybe it's dangerous because it's true." The next morning he visited the Dome of the Rock, not as a tourist, not as a scholar, just as a man with questions. He stood outside the Golden Dome, unsure what to do. A Palestinian boy approached him no older than 12. He pointed to the Qur'an Eli held. "Do you read it?" Eli hesitated. "I'm trying," the boy grinned. "Keep trying. It speaks." That night Eli read, "Indeed, this Qur'an guides to that which is most upright." Surah Al-Isra 17:9. He set the book down, closed his eyes and whispered, "Then guide me." Eli waited until after Asr to enter the masjid. He wore a plain blue shirt, no kippah, no notebook, just questions. He had contacted a Muslim professor he once publicly debated 5 years ago, Dr. Amin Kassir, a Lebanese scholar of comparative theology based in Jerusalem. Eli had humiliated him on a panel, called him soft on terror, accused him of Islamic revisionism, and yet when Eli emailed him a single line, "I need to talk," Dr. Kassir responded within minutes, "I'll be waiting after prayer. Come in peace." Eli entered the prayer hall barefoot on cool marble. He waited near the back, uncertain where to stand, what to do. Men prayed in rows, some young, some old, some with tattoos, some with tears. Not one of them looked at him like an outsider. That unnerved him more than hostility. It felt welcoming, too welcoming. When the prayer ended, Dr. Kassir found him near the shoe rack. "Dr. Stein," he said with a warm smile. Or, "Just Eli." Now Eli shook his hand. Just Eli. They sat across from each other in the imam's small library. Tea, books, quiet hum of fans. Kassir leaned in. "So, what brings you?" Eli didn't flinch. "I've been reading the Qur'an, and I have questions." Kassir nodded. "I assumed as much." "What do you want to know?" Eli didn't ease in. "Why does the Qur'an refer to Jews as those who earned Allah's anger?" Kassir didn't react. No defense, no offense. He simply replied, "The verse says, 'Not those who have earned your anger or gone astray.' Some scholars interpret those who earned anger as people who had knowledge and rejected it. That's not all Jews. That's anyone who knows truth and turns away. It could be you or me, depending on the day." Eli blinked. That wasn't the answer he expected. It wasn't condemnation, it was mirroring. He tried another. "Why does the Qur'an mention fighting? Is it not inherently violent?" Kassir smiled. "Have you read the verses before and after?" Eli nodded slowly. "Then you saw, 'Fight those who fight you, but do not transgress.' Surah Al-Baqarah 2:190. Islam permits defense, not aggression, like Deuteronomy does. Like any people must when they're attacked. It's not a religion of war, it's a religion that came to a world at war." Eli fell silent. No smug retorts, no applause. Just answers, clear, unshaken, and backed by the same texts he once used to mock. "Okay," he finally said, "then explain something else. Why do Muslims care so much about one man, this Muhammad? You worship God, yes, but why do you need him?" Kassir sat back. "You remember Moses?" Eli scoffed. "Of course. Did the Israelites follow him because they worshipped him? No. Then why? Because he was chosen. Because he brought revelation." Kassir smiled. "Exactly. And so did Muhammad." Eli leaned forward. "But Moses is in our lineage, our covenant." And yet Kassir said gently, "Your own books speak of a prophet to come, not from among you." He recited, "I will raise up for them a prophet like you from among their brothers." Deuteronomy 18:18. Not from among you, but their brothers. Ishmael, not Isaac. Eli stared at him. He had quoted that line in reverse 100 times, but never from that angle, never with that weight. "Dr. Kassir," he whispered, "I spent my life defending what I thought was truth." Kassir met his eyes. "Maybe that's what brought you here. A man who seeks truth can never lose." Eli looked down at his hands, no longer steady. "Do you believe this book, this prophet? Do you believe it's from God?" Kassir smiled. "I don't just believe it, I feel it. In the silence before prayer, in the sujood when I can't stop crying, in the way it answers me before I speak, and I see it in you, Eli. Not belief yet, but the shaking." Eli stood slowly. He felt like his legs were made of fog. "Thank you," he said, "for what Kassir asked, for not making me feel like a traitor, for asking." "You're not a traitor," he said. "You're a traveler." As Eli walked out of the masjid, he passed a boy reading Qur'an aloud in the courtyard, his voice soft, each syllable clear. Indeed, those who were given knowledge before it, when it is recited to them, fall upon their faces in prostration. Surah Al-Isra 17:107. Eli didn't understand the Arabic, but he felt the meaning, in his chest, in his bones. He wasn't falling. He was being lowered so he could finally rise. He stopped answering emails, stopped publishing, stopped teaching. For 3 weeks, Dr. Eli Stein vanished from Jerusalem's intellectual circles, and no one knew why. His university secretary told students he was on sabbatical. His colleagues whispered it was burnout. But inside his apartment, the truth was simpler. He was at war, not with the Qur'an, with himself. He had always believed the world was built on certainties, land, law, legacy. But the Qur'an didn't argue like a man, it declared like a mirror. It didn't beg to be understood. It simply stood and made you look. Every time he opened it, he found verses he couldn't argue with. Indeed, Allah commands you to render trust to whom they are due. Surah An-Nisa 4:58. O you who believe, stand firm for justice. Surah Al-Ma'idah 5:8. Do not let hatred cause you to be unjust. He stared at that one for a long time, because hatred had been part of his armor for years, disguised as loyalty. He kept reading. One night just past midnight, he reached this verse, and whoever Allah guides, none can misguide him. Surah Az-Zumar 39:37. He set the book down slowly, because suddenly, he wasn't reading it, it was reading him. The next day, his mentor, Rabbi Shlomo Brenner, showed up at his door. They hadn't spoken in months. Brenner was old, commanding, sharp-eyed. He didn't knock, he just walked in. Eli, he said, are you ill? Eli shook his head. Then why have you hidden, Eli? Hesitated. Then quietly, I've been reading the Qur'an. The silence that followed could have shattered glass. You what, reading? Studying? Learning? Brenner stepped back as if burned. Learning what? How to deny our people? No. How to understand them? Them, yes. The people we say are beneath us. The book we say is foreign, but it's not foreign. It's familiar. Brenner's face darkened. You're playing with fire. Eli didn't flinch, or walking toward it. That night, Eli booked a one-way ticket. Granada, Spain. He didn't tell anyone. He needed distance. Not from God, but from the noise. The plane touched down 2 days later. He wandered through narrow, cobbled streets far from headlines and history departments. Granada was quiet, dusty, ancient, and everywhere signs of a forgotten Islamic past. Arabic etched into archways, courtyards that once echoed Qur'an, masjids that had become cathedrals. He found an old riad with a rooftop view of the Alhambra. He rented it for a month. For the first time in his life, Eli Stein had no identity to protect, no ideology to polish, no crowd to please, just questions and quiet. Each morning he sat on the rooftop at Fajr. Didn't pray, just listened to the adhan floating from a tiny masjid nearby, to the stillness between syllables. It wasn't noise, it was invitation. One afternoon he walked into the small masjid. An old Moroccan imam smiled at him. Tourist, he asked in French accented English. Eli nodded. Maybe he said, or maybe something else. He sat in the back during Maghrib, watched the prayer, the bows, the sujud, the unity. It was nothing like the fragmented world he came from. No politics, no protests, just surrender. After the prayer, the imam approached him again. You look like a man with questions. Eli chuckled. I've got more questions than sleep. The imam grinned. Then you're already halfway there. That night, Eli read Surah Yusuf. He was drawn to it for one reason. It was about a man betrayed by his own people, then elevated through God. He read slowly, verse by verse, and then this line hit him. Indeed, he who fears Allah and is patient, then surely Allah does not allow the reward of the good to be lost. Surah Yusuf 12:90. He set the book down and whispered, I'm afraid, not of God, but of letting go. Because if he crossed this line, he couldn't go back. He couldn't unknow what he knew. He couldn't unread what he had read. But maybe that was exactly what faith required. Not blind belief, but surrendered truth. And for the first time since he picked up that gold-embossed Qur'an, he was ready. Granada was quiet that week. Too quiet. The kind of quiet that doesn't beg for answers, just prepares you to hear them. Eli had spent the last 2 days wandering alone through the ancient quarter. Books left unopened, phones switched off. Every stone arch, every whisper of Arabic in the wind reminded him of what used to be. Of a time when this place echoed with adhan, not applause. And something about that loss made his own struggle feel smaller, not less painful. Just part of a pattern. At a small cafe near Mirador de San Nicolas, Eli met Yusuf, tall American, soft-spoken. They shared a table by chance. Yusuf noticed the Qur'an beside Eli's coffee. Studying, Eli gave a half smile. Searching. Yusuf nodded slowly. I know that feeling. They talked for hours. Eli learned that Yusuf had been raised Catholic Irish-American Boston accent, ex-seminarian. He had converted to Islam 6 years earlier, left the church, left his family's expectations, but not his soul. Yusuf had found peace in prostration, not answers to every question, but silence where it mattered. Sometimes, he said, you stop looking for the right argument and just follow the voice that never left you alone. Eli looked away. What did it cost you? Yusuf didn't blink. Everything that wasn't real. That evening, Yusuf invited him to the hilltop, a view of the Alhambra at dusk, Granada glowing beneath the last breath of sunlight, olive trees swaying like they'd seen centuries. They sat in silence for a long time. Then Yusuf said, "You don't need a minaret to say it." Eli looked up. Say what? Yusuf turned toward him. The truth. The wind picked up gently. Eli's hands shook, not from fear, from finality. He had climbed too far to turn back. He looked at the Qur'an in his lap, the same copy from Istanbul, now worn, bent, underlined in dozens of places. One verse circled in thick ink. So whoever Allah wants to guide, He opens his heart to Islam. Surah Al-An'am 6:125. He closed his eyes and finally said the words, Ashhadu Allah ilaha illa Allah, wa ashhadu anna Muhammadan Rasulullah. The sun dipped below the horizon, and Eli Stein, Zionist scholar, public intellectual builder of arguments, became something else. Not smaller, not erased, just true. Yusuf didn't clap, didn't hug, he just nodded. Welcome home, brother. Eli looked out over the city. I'm not sure who I am now. Yusuf smiled. You're a servant of God. That's more than enough. They prayed Maghrib together in the grass. Eli followed Yusuf's movements, each bow a release, each sujood a surrender. And in that final prostration, for the first time in his life, Eli Stein didn't feel above anyone, or below. He just felt held. That night in his journal he wrote, I spent my life building walls of language of borders of blood, and a single verse made them crumble. He signed the entry with one word, Ilyas, the Arabic form of Elijah, not to erase who he was, but to carry forward who he had finally become. The next day he visited the masjid, asked if he could help clean. No lectures, no titles, no spotlight, just a man with rolled sleeves, a mop, and a smile. And at night, he memorized Surah Al-Ikhlas in full. Eli Stein hadn't converted to win an argument. He had surrendered to lose himself and find the one who had never stopped calling him. He stepped off the plane at Ben Gurion International with nothing but a backpack and a prayer rug. No press, no greeting party, no faculty welcome, just silence and the Qur'an in his chest pocket. He had left as Dr. Eli Stein, respected Zionist intellectual. He returned as Ilyas, still a scholar, still thoughtful. But something in his gaze had changed. It wasn't anger or defiance. It was peace. And in Jerusalem, peace is the most dangerous thing you can carry. Within 48 hours, the university board called an emergency meeting. Word had gotten out. Someone had seen him praying in a masjid courtyard in Granada. Another spotted an Arabic tweet quoting him. Then a headline dropped, renowned Zionist scholar converts to Islam, while abroad, and everything exploded. His office was locked by security, his email suspended, his students confused, some in tears, some in fury. And Rabbi Brenner. He released a public statement. Dr. Stein's choices are his own, but they no longer represent the values of our institution or people. Ilyas didn't respond. He didn't need to. The next morning he prayed Fajr in the open in a quiet park near the old city. Neon stone, forehead to earth. Birds chirped, wind moved through trees, and a man walked by with a newspaper in his hand. He paused, stared. Is that really you? Ilyas looked up calmly. Yes. The man shook his head. You were a giant. Ilyas smiled faintly. I was. Now I'm a servant. That afternoon he was invited, more like summoned by a government advisory committee. They used coded language concerns about ideological stability, impact on national narrative, possible radicalization. Ilyas sat across from a panel of polished men in suits. They didn't ask if he still loved his people. They assumed he didn't. They didn't ask why he converted. They assumed he'd been misled. He didn't defend himself. He just quoted, "O you who believe it, be persistently standing firm in justice, even if it be against yourselves." Surah An-Nisa 4:135. They didn't respond, just looked uncomfortable, as if the verse itself was a threat. He was removed from all academic positions within the week. His bank account was flagged. His publisher paused distribution. Even his neighborhood baker stopped greeting him. But the real heartbreak came quietly. His sister stopped returning his calls. His old friend Yair deleted him from a shared research group. Even some Palestinians didn't trust it. Is this some long-game infiltration? You really expect us to believe this truth? It turned out made him an orphan from both sides. So he leaned on prayer, 5 times a day, then 6. He began tahajjud, late-night prayers, and in those hours before dawn he cried, not from regret, from release, from the weight finally gone. One night after Isha, he received a text. Unknown number. I saw you in the courtyard. You were glowing. Another text followed. I'm not ready, but I'm watching. He smiled. There were always eyes, always seekers hidden in silence. He started a blog under the name Ibn Adam, son of Adam. Anonymous at first, just reflections, short ayat that changed his heart. No polemics, no debates, just truth spoken softly. Within weeks, it had thousands of readers. Comments poured in, I'm Jewish, but I've felt the same tug. You put into words what I never dared to say out loud. I don't know if I believe yet, but I'm not mocking anymore. He didn't push. He just kept writing. And when asked if he would ever return to teaching, he said no. Not until I know how to teach hearts. One Friday while walking to the masjid, he passed a familiar face. It was one of his old students, Daniel, eyes wide stunned. Is it true, he asked? Ilyas paused. That I became Muslim? Daniel nodded. Yes, Ilyas smiled. Then yes, it's true, but why? Ilyas handed him a folded note. It was a verse. Is he who was dead, and we gave him life and made for him a light by which to walk among the people. Surah Al-An'am 6:122. Daniel read it twice, then said nothing. Just watched Ilyas walk away, light spilling at his feet. It had been almost a year since Istanbul, since Granada, since Sujud, and Ilyas had changed, not in the loud ways the world expected, not in arguments or declarations, but in how he walked, how he paused before sunrise, how he forgave before sleeping, how he said Bismillah before unlocking his door. The changes were so quiet you'd miss them unless you listened closely, like listening for a heartbeat through stone. He lived simply now. Small apartment in East Jerusalem, shared meals at the masjid, no headlines, no podiums. His world had grown smaller and his heart wider. He no longer feared being misunderstood. He feared being ungrateful. One morning after Fajr, he stood by his window. The sky was soft pink, the air still, and he felt it, the pull to return to a place he hadn't seen since before everything broke, the Western Wall. He hesitated, not out of fear, but out of reverence. He no longer saw it as his wall, or their wall, just another piece of earth, touched by generations, crying out for heaven. He arrived just before noon. Crowds gathered as usual, men with black hats, tourists with cameras, guards with rifles. He walked in alone. No sign, no statement, no Qur'an in hand, just presence. Some recognized him. One whispered, "That's him." Another pulled out a phone. He ignored them, walked straight to the stone, placed his right hand on it, closed his eyes and whispered, "Ya Allah, forgive me, forgive us, for every stone we raised in pride and every truth we buried in fear." He stood there for a long time. He didn't quote, didn't analyze. He just prayed for his people, for those who called him traitor, for those who called him brother, and for those still on the edge waiting for something to break like he once was. A man beside him tapped his shoulder. "Do you still believe what you taught?" Ilyas turned slowly. "Some of it, yes, but now I believe in what I never dared to face." "And what's that?" He smiled. "That truth doesn't need to be defended. It just needs to be followed." He walked back slowly through the plaza, and as he passed the gates, a familiar voice called from behind Ilyas. He turned. It was Daniel, his former student, sweating breathless, a Qur'an in hand. "I've been reading," Ilyas smiled, and Daniel looked down. "It's not what they said." "No," Ilyas said softly. "It never was." Daniel held out the book. "Will you teach me how to recite it?" Ilyas placed a hand on his shoulder. "I'll teach you how to live it." That night back home, he opened to a page he hadn't visited in months. Surah Al-Fath, the chapter of victory, and read, "He it is who sent his messenger with guidance and the religion of truth to manifest it over all religion. And sufficient is Allah as witness." Surah Al-Fath 48:28. He closed the Qur'an, pressed it to his chest. "You manifested truth not through argument," he whispered, "but through peace." In the silence, he heard the faint adhan from a distant minaret. He stood, rolled out his prayer mat, and bowed. His forehead touched the ground. And for the first time in his life, he didn't feel like a scholar. He felt like a servant, a man who had come from fire, through ideology, through war, through walls, and found water. They say men like him don't exist, but if you ever hear a soft prayer near a stone wall in Jerusalem, look again, because truth doesn't always shout. Sometimes it just bows. He was an Oxford theologian, a former priest, respected, brilliant, feared in debate. For years he taught that Islam was a theological misstep, a denial of divine truth. Then one day, he vanished from academia. No lectures, no interviews, just silence, until a photo appeared. There he was inside a mosque in East London, in sujood, crying. The man who once lectured against Islam was now whispering, "La ilaha illallah." What did he read in the Quran that his years of theology never answered? What voice called him not to argue, but to bow? Press 1 if this story pulls you in. Press 2 if it doesn't. But either way, you won't forget what happens next. The email simply said, "Dr. Blake is no longer available for lectures this term. We appreciate your understanding." No explanation, no farewell note, just silence. At first, his students thought it was an error. He was, after all, the backbone of the Oxford Divinity School, a former Anglican priest turned academic giant, a published author, BBC guest, and trusted voice in interfaith debates. But as the days passed and the rumors thickened, a photo surfaced online. It wasn't from a church, not from a conference. It was taken quietly, grainy, from the back of a modest mosque in East London. There on a plain carpet among worshippers sat a man in sujood, his forehead pressed to the floor, his shoulders trembling. No robes, no collar, just humility. And though the image was unclear, anyone who knew him could tell it was Dr. Jonathan Blake. Within hours, religious blogs caught fire. Oxford professor seen praying in mosque. Theologian turned Muslim. Has Jonathan Blake apostatized? Students were stunned. Clergy whispered betrayal. His publisher suspended upcoming contracts. And the Church of England silent. Inside academic circles, theories bloomed. He cracked under pressure. Maybe it's a stunt. He's writing a new book. This must be research. No, he's lost. But no one had answers. Not even his closest colleagues. Because Dr. Blake wasn't speaking. His phones were off. His office was locked. And the lecture halls that once echoed with his sharp, deliberate voice sat quiet. What no one knew was that in a small guest room above a halal bakery in East London, the former professor sat in the dark facing the Qibla before dawn. The Quran was open in his lap. He didn't understand all the Arabic yet, but he understood enough. And when the adhan rose gently from the masjid across the street, he whispered, barely audible, "Lord, if this is truth, let it take me completely, even if it cost me everything I've built." Then he stood, raised his hands, and bowed. Not as a scholar, not as a priest, but as a man ready to listen. Before the silence, before the photo, before the masjid, there was Dr. Jonathan Blake, a theologian of towering intellect, a man whose presence could quiet a room with just his posture. Anglican priest turned Oxford professor, he was known by many names: scholar, preacher, mentor, polemicist, heretic slayer. He had spent his life defending Christian orthodoxy. His lectures on Christology were packed wall to wall. His book, God in Three Persons, had become essential reading for seminary students across the UK. Jonathan didn't just teach theology, he embodied it. He walked the gardens of Oxford with the same reverence he had once felt in the cathedrals of his youth. He wore tailored coats, spoke with precision, and never once stuttered when defending the Trinity. In public forums, he had debated atheists, skeptics, and more than once Muslims. Not out of disdain, he would clarify, but out of conviction. Islam, he once said during a university interfaith panel, is a theological regression, an attempt to flatten divine complexity into monolithic clarity. It denies the cross, the resurrection, and worst of all, the incarnation. It is not revelation, it is rejection. No one in the audience questioned him. They didn't need to. He said it with such clarity, such confidence, such certainty. And certainty is magnetic. Students followed him like disciples. He could walk into any hall and hold silence for 10 seconds, then fill it with thunder. But even iron certainties rust. It began of all places at a modest theology conference in Cambridge. Jonathan had just delivered a keynote on defending the doctrine of divine mystery in a rational age. It was eloquent, cutting, convincing. Afterward, as the applause died and the crowd dispersed for tea, a young man approached him. Polite, quiet, no clerical collar, no challenge in his eyes. Just a calm curiosity. He extended his hand in a small book. The Qur'an. Plain black cover. English translation. No footnotes. He said only this: "I don't expect you to agree, sir, but read it like you expect it to challenge you." Jonathan gave the polite, closed-lipped smile of a man used to being handed nonsense. He nodded, took the book, thanked the boy, walked away. He didn't open it that night, but he didn't throw it away either. Back in Oxford, the book sat on his shelf wedged between the Confessions of Augustine and the Nicene Fathers. He meant to forget it. But late one evening, while rereading a commentary on the Gospel of John, his eyes drifted to it. He hesitated, then reached for it. He didn't know where to begin, so he opened it at random. Surah Maryam, and mention in the book the story of Mary when she withdrew from her family to a place toward the east. He read, slowly, Mary's solitude, the angel, the miracle birth of Isa Jesus, not mocked, not minimized, but honored, a virgin birth, a righteous son, not as God, but as a prophet, still holy, still chosen. Jonathan leaned back in his chair. He expected tension, contradiction, but what he felt was respect. He closed the book, but it was too late. Something had slipped past the gate. Over the next few nights, he returned to it again and again, quietly, after evensong, when the city was still, not to critique, not to compare, just to see. He skipped around Surah Yusuf, Surah Ibrahim, Surah Ikhlas. He found names he had known his entire life. Abraham, Moses, Noah, Jesus, spoken of in ways both familiar and profoundly different. No Trinity, no blood atonement, no divine mystery, just submission. Just God, one, eternal, uncreated. It unnerved him. He opened his Bible in parallel, tried to anchor himself, but something had shifted. The Quran wasn't cold, it wasn't chaotic, it was precise. And something about that precision unsettled a man who had made a living off divine ambiguity. He told himself it was academic curiosity. That's how it always starts, doesn't it? That's what Dr. Jonathan Blake had said 100 times before, when students asked if reading non-Christian scripture was dangerous. Truth, he'd respond with a smile, can stand against any test. But now, sitting alone in his study, surrounded by shelves of leather-bound theology texts, Jonathan wasn't so sure which side of the test he was on anymore. The Quran had begun to pull at him, not as a rival to be defeated, but as a voice that wouldn't stop speaking. It wasn't the theology, not at first. It was the tone, the rhythm, the quiet confidence with which it spoke of God. He returned again to Surah Maryam, not as a theologian, not even as a reader, but as something else, something he hadn't been in years, a listener. He read about Mary, terrified and trembling, about the birth of Isa, spoken as a baby, declaring servanthood, not divinity. It wasn't blasphemous, it wasn't hostile, it was reverent. Jonathan remembered how in seminary one professor had described Islam as a Christian heresy in Arabic dress. But this didn't feel like heresy. It felt like a reminder of something purer, older, undiluted. He turned to Surah Yusuf, the story of Joseph, told with elegance, drama, but most strikingly, sincerity. Indeed, in their stories is a lesson for those of understanding. The phrase struck him like a whisper down the spine. This book wasn't trying to impress him. It wasn't appealing to logic or pity. It was simply certain. He kept reading. Surah Al-Anbiya, the prophets, Surah Al-Ikhlas, the brief, piercing clarity of divine oneness. Surah Al-Baqarah, long, intricate, overwhelming at first, but strangely magnetic. Every page seemed to echo the same idea: God is one, without partner, without image, without need. It was too clean, too exact. He searched for contradictions, weaknesses, contrived philosophies. But what he found was silence. The kind of silence that follows a truth you didn't want to find but can't unhear once you do. At night he dreamed of calligraphy, of vast deserts, of a voice not loud but persistent reciting in Arabic. He would wake up sweating, gasping, unsure whether the chills in his spine were awe or fear. One Sunday evening, after a quiet evensong service, he stayed behind in the chapel. He knelt at the altar, something he'd done countless times before. But this time the prayer didn't come. The words he had memorized, the flow of Anglican liturgy, felt empty. He whispered instead, "Lord, who are you really?" He didn't say it aloud, didn't finish the prayer. But in that unfinished question, something opened. He went back to his study, opened both books, his Bible and the Qur'an, side by side. He spent hours mapping passages, comparing stories of the prophets. What struck him was not just the similarities, but the way the Qur'an handled them. There was no speculation, no mythology, no divine drama, just message after message calling the reader not to interpret God, but to surrender to Him. One verse from Surah Al-Hajj shook him. "So give good tidings to my servants who listen to speech and follow the best of it. Those are the ones Allah has guided." He closed the Qur'an and sat for a long time in the dark. Not because he doubted God, but because he was beginning to doubt everything else. He stopped bringing up Islam in his lectures. When students asked about it, he would deflect, offering vague summaries and avoiding theological confrontation. Not because he no longer had an answer, but because he feared what the real answer might be. He started praying differently, still using Christian language, but something had changed in his tone. Less assertion, more longing. One night, instead of Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, he simply said, "God, if you are one, then I am many. And I am tired of pretending I'm not." It wasn't conversion, not yet, but it was the beginning of surrender. And for a man who had lived his whole life defending the walls of doctrine, he had just found a crack and couldn't stop peering through. The dreams began quietly. At first they came once a week, then every night. In them, Dr. Jonathan Blake walked through unfamiliar cities, narrow stone alleys with faded Arabic signs, calls to prayer echoing from rooftops. Sometimes he would stand in a crowd of people moving in unison, bowing, prostrating, rising again in rhythm. Other times he wandered alone in a desert, always searching, always walking towards something just out of view. And in every dream, a voice, melodic, firm, unfamiliar, not in English, but it made his chest tighten. He would wake up breathless, heart pounding, the verses ringing in his ears, though he didn't yet understand them. He still taught his theology classes, still wore his tweed jackets and greeted students with the same charming Oxford smile. But something in his tone had changed. A softness, a hesitance, a faint tremor behind the usual confidence. He caught himself mid-lecture one afternoon, explaining the Trinity with a diagram of 3 intersecting circles. A student raised a hand. "Dr. Blake, if God is beyond comprehension, how can we claim this specific model is true?" Jonathan opened his mouth to answer, but nothing came out. He simply looked at the diagram, then at the faces watching him, and said, "That's an excellent question. Perhaps we should all ask it more often." He had always told himself that doubts were part of faith. But this wasn't a doubt. This was a quiet unraveling, not in his belief in God, but in the scaffolding built around him. The doctrines, the creeds, the philosophical metaphors he had defended for decades. He began skipping chapel, started withdrawing from college dinners. His wife Elizabeth noticed. "You're drifting," she said one evening over tea. I don't know where you go after lectures. You've been distant, secretive. He didn't answer right away. He couldn't. He had started visiting a small masjid tucked between a laundrette and a Somali cafe in East London. Not as a convert, as an observer. He would slip in during Dur or Maghrib, sit in the back and just watch. No one questioned him. No one gave him strange looks. Occasionally someone would nod politely and smile. The prayers moved him in a way that nothing else did anymore. There was no band, no sermon, no performance, just men, bowing in stillness, whispering verses he couldn't yet say. He began learning how to make wudu, first from online videos, then from a quiet shopkeeper named Amin, who offered to show him one afternoon when they crossed paths after Asr. The ritual cleansing felt intimate, ancient, like washing away not just dirt, but layers of pride. At night, Jonathan began trying the prayer motions alone. He didn't know the Arabic yet. He just whispered whatever came to his heart. And when he placed his forehead to the ground, awkward, unsure, trembling, something within him shattered, not in grief, in relief. He tried fasting on Mondays and Thursdays. The first week he failed by noon. By the third week he found something in the hunger, clarity, not euphoria, not mysticism, just silence. A calm in the chest he hadn't felt since he was a child before religion became a career. One evening, while reviewing a draft for a new academic paper, he crossed out the title Christology in the Postmodern Age, and in its place scribbled, "What if the truth we fear is the truth that frees us?" He stared at the page for an hour, then closed his laptop and prayed again, face to the carpet body, trembling, whispering only God. Guide me, even if it undoes everything. He still hadn't told Elizabeth, still hadn't told his department, still hadn't told anyone. But one evening while walking home past the River Cherwell, he paused on a footbridge and looked out at the water below. For the first time in his life, he felt like he was not standing above the truth, but being invited beneath it, to be immersed, to let go. It was supposed to be a routine guest lecture. The topic, the necessity of Trinitarian doctrine in contemporary theology. The setting, All Souls College Chapel, Oxford. A full house. Jonathan had delivered this talk before 6 times over the past decade. Each time it had drawn applause, debate, even standing ovations. It was familiar ground, well-trodden, intellectually fortified. But this time, something was different. He stood behind the lectern manuscript in hand tie, perfectly straight. The students quieted. The recording light blinked red. A dozen professors watched from the front row. Jonathan opened with a confident voice. "We begin with the mystery of God, one essence revealed in 3 persons, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit." But before he reached the 3rd sentence, his tongue faltered. His hands grew cold. He looked down at the page, and the words blurred. He tried again, read aloud the next paragraph, but it came out flat, mechanical. There was no weight in it, no conviction. He looked up at the students, young and attentive, and in a sudden, dizzying moment of clarity, he realized he no longer believed what he was saying. Not fully, not honestly. His throat tightened. He closed the folder slowly and gripped the edges of the lectern as if to steady the spinning of the room. "I'm sorry," he said quietly. There was a pause, an awkward shuffle among students. I need to speak truthfully." He drew a deep breath, felt the centuries of tradition pressing on his shoulders. "There was a time I could explain the Trinity like poetry, wrap it in metaphors, tie it to church history, and I still respect that heritage deeply. But today, I must confess, I no longer know whether I believe this doctrine is true, he hesitated, or simply inherited." Gasps broke out. One student began writing furiously. Another looked at his friend stunned. The professors in the front row exchanged glances. One whispered something under his breath. Jonathan continued softer now. "This isn't a conversion. This isn't rebellion. This is a man admitting, I've built a tower of language around God, and I don't know if he ever asked for it. And I think real faith must begin where performance ends." He stepped back, closed the folder, and walked out. The news spread by nightfall. Oxford theology chair steps down mid-lecture. Blake renounces the Trinity faith crisis or theological evolution. By morning, the university had placed him on academic sabbatical. His department issued a carefully worded memo. Dr. Blake has chosen to take a personal leave for theological reflection. But behind the doors of the divinity faculty, the whispers were sharper. He was called unstable, a liability, a threat. His colleagues stopped returning his messages. A research grant was quietly withdrawn. One publishing house canceled an upcoming manuscript. Even Elizabeth fell silent. She slept in the guest room now. She didn't yell. She didn't ask questions. She just disappeared into her routine, as if afraid that whatever had broken in him might be contagious. Jonathan packed a suitcase, just enough to disappear for a while. He left Oxford in the early morning, walking through the foggy quad past the gate he had entered proudly for nearly 20 years. He took the train east, past the manicured fields, past the signs with names from old theology textbooks, past the familiar, to a different London, not Westminster, not Kensington, but a dense, modest borough full of immigrants and honesty and noise, where no one cared about degrees or doctrines. He rented a room above a halal bakery. The walls were thin, the carpet threadbare, but the masjid was 2 blocks away, and the adhan reached his window like an invitation. That evening, Jonathan Blake, once the voice of Anglican theology at Oxford, sat in the back row of Masjid Noor. Unnoticed, unnamed, uncertain, but in sujud, even without the words, he knew one thing with full clarity. He wasn't pretending anymore. The masjid smelled of worn carpet, oud incense, and something Jonathan couldn't quite name, something like stillness. It wasn't grand. No domes, no stained glass, just beige walls, stacked Qur'ans, and rows of quiet men, shoulders brushing as they bowed and rose again. Jonathan came for the silence. He didn't know the rituals. He didn't understand the Arabic. But when he sat cross-legged in the back, watching from a distance, he felt something he hadn't felt in years. Safety. Not in belief, in surrender. No one asked his name. Not at first. They greeted him with salam and warm eyes, offered him dates during iftar, invited him to sit with them after Maghrib. A man named Farid handed him a small booklet, How to Pray, a beginner's guide without pressure, without assumptions. He read it that night by the yellow light of his bedside lamp, folded the corners of pages, practiced the motions in his room awkwardly at first, his forehead barely touching the floor. But by the 5th attempt, his body stopped resisting, and his heart began to weep. The imam noticed him, not as a stranger, but as a soul orbiting the edge of something deeper. After Asr one day, he approached Jonathan with a soft smile. "You're welcome here as long as you need. There's no rush. We only ask that you be honest with yourself more than with us." Jonathan blinked back tears. It had been months since anyone had spoken to him without expectation. Days became weeks. He came to every salah, sat in halakas, ate biryani with taxi drivers and engineers and tailors, spoke less, listened more. He began memorizing Al-Fatiha, line by line, syllable by syllable, not for show, for truth. One evening just before Maghrib, he asked the imam if they could speak privately. They sat in the imam's tiny office, 2 chairs, 1 shelf, and a pot of mint tea between them. Jonathan's voice trembled. "I've spent my entire life defining God for others, teaching, arguing, preaching, but I don't think I've ever let him define me." He hesitated. "I'm still learning, still uncertain in some places, but I know I can't walk away from this. I believe in this. I believe in him, one, alone." The imam nodded slowly. "Then you are ready." That night, a small circle of brothers gathered. No cameras, no microphones, just human hearts bearing witness. Jonathan stood with his hands shaking. The imam recited the words, "Ashhadu an la ilaha illallah, wa ashhadu anna Muhammadan Rasulullah." Jonathan repeated, voice cracking, "I bear witness, there is no God but Allah, and Muhammad is his messenger." A pause. Then from the brothers, "Allahu Akbar." Tears welled in his eyes. One man hugged him, another wept beside him. A third handed him a miswak with trembling hands. He smiled, not from pride, not from certainty, from peace. That night he wrote in his journal for the first time in weeks, "I didn't find Islam through debate. I found it when I finally stopped trying to be right and asked to be real. He signed the bottom, Idris Blake, a servant, nothing more. In the still hours before dawn, he stood on the soft carpet in the masjid, now empty. He raised his hands, whispered Allahu Akbar, and as he bowed in prayer, alone but not alone, he understood something profound. He hadn't lost himself. He had finally come home. The photo wasn't meant to go public. It was snapped quietly after Fajr prayer, just a few brothers enjoying tea on the masjid steps. Someone posted it on a community WhatsApp group. No caption, no announcement. But by evening, the photo had made its way to an Anglican theology forum, and then to Twitter, and then everywhere. There he was, clear as daylight, Jonathan Blake, former Oxford professor and priest, sitting cross-legged outside a London mosque, smiling with a copy of the Qur'an resting in his lap. The reaction was swift. Former Oxford theologian converts to Islam, tragedy of a scholar. Blake denies the Trinity from the collar to the crescent. What happened to Jonathan Blake? His old colleagues at Oxford didn't reach out. They didn't need to. Their silence was its own verdict. He was removed from guest lecture rosters. Invitations to interfaith events dried up. His name disappeared from the next edition of Contemporary Christian Theologians. The Church of England issued a cautious statement: "We grieve when any shepherd strays from the flock. We pray for Dr. Blake's return to the truth of Christ." But what hurt more than public speculation was the personal silence. Elizabeth didn't confront him. She didn't scream, accused a man. She just stood at the kitchen counter one morning, eyes hollow, and said, "I didn't marry a Muslim." She packed her bags that afternoon, left her ring on the windowsill, left a single note on the dining table: "I hope you find peace. I just can't follow you into this." She didn't leave a forwarding address. His brother, an Anglican bishop, blocked his number. A longtime student emailed him only one sentence: "You were the reason I believed, and now you're the reason I doubt." He closed the laptop and wept. He walked to the masjid that evening without speaking a word. Farid saw him come in, eyes red, expression blank, and placed a warm cup of chai in his hand. No questions, just presence. Later that night, as he sat in the corner of the prayer hall alone, Uncle Yusuf, the eldest member of the congregation, approached slowly and sat beside him. They didn't speak for several minutes. Then Yusuf said quietly, "You've lost a world, but Allah will build you a better one. It just won't look like the one you left behind." Jonathan Idris nodded. He had no words, only tears. For days he avoided the news. But one headline caught his eye: Blake's fall, from grace a scholar's apostasy. He laughed, not out of amusement, but fatigue. He had not fallen, he had knelt. One morning he arrived at the masjid before Fajr. On the door, folded neatly, was a handwritten note. No name, no return address. "I read your books in university. I was angry when I saw your photo. Then I read the book you read. I'm not ready yet, but I'm no longer afraid to ask." Idris folded the note carefully, placed it inside his Qur'an, and whispered, "Alhamdulillah." He had lost colleagues, lost comfort, lost a name. But in what remained: clean floors, quiet prayers, simple meals, and a Lord who asked for nothing but surrender, he had found more than he ever expected. Not recognition, not vindication, just peace. And the peace was enough. Years passed. The headlines faded. The outrage dissolved into newer scandals. The name Jonathan Blake became a footnote in digital archives and forgotten lecture notes. But in a quiet corner of East London, a man named Idris Blake walked each morning to Masjid Noor with a wool scarf around his shoulders and a folded Qur'an pressed to his chest. He no longer checked theology forums, no longer taught seminars, no longer wore collars or introduced himself with credentials. He swept the masjid floors before Jumu'ah, taught small Qur'an lessons to children who couldn't yet pronounce Ra, listened more than he spoke. Some of the brothers eventually learned who he had been. A few asked questions. Most didn't. They knew enough. He was Idris. He was sincere. He was here. One rainy afternoon after Asr, a young university student approached him shyly. "Brother Idris, were you really a priest?" A professor, Idris, smiled gently, looked down at the boy's notebook filled with scribbled tafsir notes. "I was many things," he said, "but mostly, I was a man who mistook complexity for closeness, who thought he needed to explain God instead of obey him. The student hesitated, then asked, "What finally convinced you?" Idris looked up at the gray clouds beyond the masjid window. It wasn't one verse, not a single argument, not even a dream. He placed his hand on the boy's shoulder. It was silence. When I stopped defending what I had always believed and just asked God to guide me. And then he did. That night, Idris sat beneath a tree behind the masjid journal on his lap. Not the one filled with sermon outlines and theological charts. A new one, filled with verses, prayers, quiet reflections. He turned to a blank page, wrote just one line: "I was born again, not through fire, but through sujud." He closed the book and whispered Bismillah, then walked barefoot back toward the door of the masjid. In the final years of his life, he would never give another public lecture, never debate on stages, never publish another book. But his silence taught more than his voice ever had. Because Idris Blake no longer prayed to be heard. He prayed to be true. Truth rarely arrives with applause. Sometimes it comes quietly in stillness, in solitude, in a whisper that challenges everything we've built our lives upon. Dr. Idris Blake's story reminds us that real transformation doesn't always come through force or intellect, but through surrender. He was once celebrated for his certainty, his words, his wit, his theological mastery. But it was in silence and sujud that he finally found peace. The lesson is timeless. Let go of who the world expects you to be and ask honestly who you were created to become. True courage isn't in defending beliefs at all costs, but in having the humility to follow truth wherever it leads, even when it costs you your name. Because at the end of all arguments, all debates, all platforms, God doesn't ask who you impressed. He asks, did you submit? He was a world-renowned historian, respected, sharp, and proudly skeptical. His mission to dismantle the legacy of Prophet Muhammad with evidence, logic, and academic firepower. But the deeper he dug, the quieter he became. No scandals, no contradictions, no myth to expose. Just a man poor, persecuted, yet profoundly consistent. A book that dared him to disprove it, and a truth that refused to break. Until one day, standing before a global audience, he whispered the words that shocked the world, "I can't refute him." What makes a scholar abandon pride for prayer? What did he find between the lines of history that shattered his certainty? Press 1 if you find the story interesting. Press 2 if you find the story boring. But either way, you won't forget it. The lecture hall buzzed with intellectual anticipation. Rows of students, professors, skeptics, and reporters filled the seats, notebooks, open pens ready. At the front stood Dr. Edward Langston, a man known as much for his brutal honesty as for his towering academic resume. He had built his reputation dismantling ancient religious narratives carefully, surgically, and without apology. Tonight's lecture was titled The Historical Muhammad Man Myth or Messenger. The screen behind him flickered to life with that exact question as he stepped up to the podium. Edward adjusted his glasses and scanned the crowd. His voice was cool, precise. "I've spent the better part of 30 years separating theology from verifiable history," he began. "And now I've turned my attention to the most globally followed figure, least critically examined in the West, the Prophet Muhammad." A ripple of murmured interest passed through the audience. "This won't be a sermon," he said with a faint smirk. "This is research, and I intend to publish what may become the most controversial biography ever written of Islam's founder." Laughter, nervous, curious, rose from a few corners of the room. The confidence was contagious. But in the back row, a young man named Zaid Noor sat quietly, his hands folded. He made no expression, offered no rebuttal. Just a silent dua whispered from his heart, "Ya Allah, let truth defend itself." Edward continued with his usual sharpness, citing sources, outlining frameworks, and promising bold conclusions. The applause that followed was confident, almost celebratory. He stepped off the stage to a flurry of questions. But as the crowd began to thin, Zaid walked forward, calm, respectful. In his hands was a small Arabic copy of the Qur'an. "You probably won't read it," Zaid said softly, "but if you're studying the Prophet, you might want the original source, even if just for tone." Edward raised an eyebrow, accepting the book more out of curiosity than interest. Inside was a note, not to convince, just to understand. That night back in his office, Edward tossed the Quran beside a pile of history books. He didn't know it yet, but he had just picked up the one text that wouldn't let him remain unchanged. Dr. Edward Langston had always believed that faith collapsed under close inspection. Every religious system, when pushed far enough into the light of reason, eventually cracked, whether in its contradictions, its authorship, or its historical reliability. He had made a career out of pushing. That's why the Quran on his desk remained unopened for nearly a week. It sat there like a dare, thin, leather-bound, almost too small to hold the kind of weight believers claimed it did. A simple note still tucked inside. Not to convince, just to understand. One evening, as the sky dimmed behind the library's glass windows, Edward sighed and pulled it closer. "Let's see what all the reverence is about," he muttered. He began where many skeptics did, with the intention to find flaw, not meaning. He expected stories. He expected legend. He expected perhaps a narrative echoing other ancient scriptures, riddled with symbolism and loose with chronology. What he did not expect was clarity. The first thing that struck him was the voice. The Quran did not read like something Muhammad had written about God. It read like something God was saying to Muhammad directly. It addressed him, commanded him, sometimes consoled him, sometimes rebuked him, and that alone rattled Edward. "This is odd," he whispered aloud. The subject of the book is being spoken to, not speaking for himself. It wasn't just the voice. It was the absence of the typical hallmarks of myth. There were no divine genealogies, no long symbolic rituals of gods at war, no attempts to seduce with imagination. Instead, the Quran was relentlessly focused on one thing: truth. Its tone was urgent, serious, often poetic, but never fanciful. Still, Edward pressed on. He highlighted verses, cross-referenced historical claims, scribbled critiques in the margins. He stayed up late comparing translations, trying to find inconsistencies, different renderings, vague wording loopholes to pin as human tampering. Then late one night he found it, a verse that stopped him cold. Do they not reflect upon the Quran? Had it been from other than Allah, they would have found in it much contradiction. Quran 4:82. He read it again and again, slowly. It wasn't a claim, it was a challenge. The book wasn't pleading to be believed, it was daring him to disprove it. Edward leaned back in his chair. His eyes scanned the shelves behind him, lined with books that danced around. Truth embellished it, dramatized it, reshaped it to fit cultural or political ends. But this was different. This book didn't flatter, it confronted. He scribbled in the margins, unusual tone, not defensive, invites scrutiny. The next day, he saw Zaid Noor again, this time in the faculty courtyard, sipping coffee alone. Edward approached with cautious curiosity. "That book you gave me," he said. "It doesn't read like a story." Zaid looked up, calm as ever. "It's not a story, it's a conversation." Edward frowned. "But Muhammad, he didn't write it." Zaid shook his head. He couldn't read or write. There was no boast in his tone, just quiet fact. The Quran wasn't his authorship, Zaid said. It was his burden. That word hit deeper than Edward expected. Burden, not achievement, not legacy. Burden. He went home that evening more disturbed than he cared to admit. He reread verse after verse. Commands to reflect, to question, to think. Not emotional coercion, not irrational threat. The voice was firm, yes, but never manipulative. It didn't feel like propaganda. It felt like revelation. That realization made him uncomfortable. He reminded himself he still had the Prophet's life to analyze: the wars, the marriages, the rise of Islamic law. That's where he would find the human hand at work, the political motivation, the flaws. But something in his mind had already shifted. This wasn't just another sacred text. This book spoke back. And for the first time in years, Dr. Edward Langston didn't know whether he was reading something ancient or something alive. Dr. Edward Langston had spent his life dissecting legends. He had analyzed the rise of messianic figures, the evolution of scriptures, the socio-political motives behind early religions. He could predict the arc of most prophets' biographies before reading them, usually beginning in obscurity, gaining followers through charisma or manipulation, ending in legacy-laced death and posthumous myth-making. So when he opened a detailed seerah of the Prophet Muhammad, he expected more of the same. He was already constructing a framework in his mind: tribal instability, economic opportunity, religious syncretism, typical ingredients for charismatic control. But the deeper he read, the more that framework fell apart. This wasn't the story of a man who sought power. It was the story of a man who ran from it. Born an orphan, raised without privilege, married to one woman for most of his early life, no political ambitions, no wealth accumulated. His first public message wasn't popular, it was dangerous. It earned him mockery, isolation, boycotts. His few early followers had more to lose than to gain. Edward underlined this line in the biography. He was offered kingship and wealth by Quraysh, if only he would stop preaching. And the prophet said, if they placed the sun in my right hand and the moon in my left, I would not abandon this message. Edward stared at that quote for a long time. He imagined himself in Muhammad's place, offered status, riches, leadership, and realized almost any man would have compromised. Any man but one who truly believed he carried a message beyond himself. He flipped forward, digging into the records of battles. He expected brutality, command for conquest, political maneuvering. Instead, he found warnings against harming civilians, orders not to destroy crops or harm children, a strict code of ethical warfare centuries ahead of its time. He found examples of forgiveness that made no political sense: forgiving his torturers, praying for his enemies, showing mercy when revenge was fully within reach. This was not the warlord he had set out to expose. And then there were the prophet's personal habits. He repaired his own shoes, slept on woven mats, gave away food, never built a palace, never left behind treasure, and when he died, his shield was pawned to pay a debt. Edward's notes became messier, more hesitant. He wrote in the margin, no signs of delusion, no material incentive, no dynastic succession planned. It was not the absence of scandal that shook Edward. It was the overwhelming presence of restraint. No ego, no contradictions between public and private life, no unraveling under pressure. One night, Edward sat in his office long after the lights on campus had dimmed. The stack of books around him had grown high: academic texts, Hadith collections, works by Muslim and non-Muslim historians alike. He leaned back, hands behind his head, eyes locked on the ceiling. He whispered more to himself than to anyone. This is not the profile of a liar, or a madman, or a manipulator. There was too much consistency, too much sacrifice, too much sincerity. But the hardest part for Edward to admit was that he was starting to admire him. Not as a historical subject, but as a man. What kind of person builds a civilization through words, endures exile and loss, refuses power, and still commands the love of billions? What kind of man dies without leaving behind a single coin, but leaves behind an entire way of life? Edward tried to tell himself he was just being objective, that this was still research, that he was still in control of the narrative. But deep down, something was already giving way. This wasn't about anthropology anymore. It was about truth. And truth, he was starting to see, wasn't something you build. It was something you recognize. And perhaps for the first time in his life, Edward Langston was beginning to recognize it, not in theories or titles or degrees, but in the life of a man too consistent to invent. The hall was packed. Scholars from across the country filled the velvet chairs of the prestigious Global Symposium on Religion and Reason. Journalists lingered by the walls. Theology students typed eagerly into laptops. Some attendees clutched copies of Dr. Edward Langston's previous works, books that had systematically dismantled religious traditions with academic precision. He had been introduced as the keynote speaker months earlier, with a lecture title announced boldly, "The Myth of Muhammad, Deconstructing the Final Prophet." The organizers expected a masterclass in critique, a dismantling of centuries of belief, a final scholarly nail in the coffin of prophetic legitimacy. But Edward hadn't written that speech. In his hotel room the night before, he had opened the manuscript he'd planned to present, only to close it again with shaking hands. The words rang hollow. His old certainty had grown quiet. His research hadn't confirmed his thesis, it had unraveled it. Now, standing at the podium, bathed in stage lights and academic expectation, he felt more exposed than ever. He looked out at the crowd, some nodding, some smirking, all waiting. He cleared his throat. "I want to begin," he said slowly, "not as a scholar, but as a man who thought he understood what truth looked like. The room went still. I came to this subject as a skeptic, he continued. I approached the life of Prophet Muhammad with every tool a critical historian has: source analysis, political context, psychological profiling. He paused, choosing each word with care. I expected to find contradiction, myth-making ambition. I expected to find fabrication. He looked up, but what I found was something I didn't expect at all. Whispers rippled across the back rows. Edward placed his notes aside. I found coherence. I found restraint. I found mercy where vengeance would have been easier. I found moral clarity that didn't benefit the speaker. I found a man who, by every historical metric, should have failed, and yet left behind a legacy that continues to shape nearly 2 billion lives. Silence. No scribbling. No typing. Just breath. He stepped back from the microphone slightly. And so I must confess something. The air tightened. I can't refute him. A gasp near the front. A professor whispered, "What is he doing?" Edward pressed on, voice steady now. I'm not here to convert. I haven't taken a leap of faith. But I can no longer pretend that this man, this prophet, was a liar, or a lunatic, or a legend. I believe he was sincere. And more than that, I believe he was telling the truth. He let it sit, like stone on glass. I've studied too many founders, too many fabrications, too many broken ideologies dressed in scripture. But Muhammad stands apart. Someone in the back stood up and walked out. Another followed. He didn't flinch. I realize what this means for my career. I realize what this may cost me in academic circles. But if scholarship doesn't allow space for truth when it's inconvenient, then it's not worth pursuing. A student raised their hand. So, do you believe in God? Now Edward looked out at the room, not as an expert, but as a man who had come undone. I don't know what I believe about God yet, he said, but I believe Muhammad was exactly who he claimed to be. Another silence. Afterward, reporters flooded the hallway. Some accused him of betrayal, others of sensationalism. He gave no interviews. Instead, he quietly stepped outside, away from the noise, into the cold night air. Zaid Noor was waiting by the edge of the parking lot. He hadn't attended the lecture, but he had felt it in his heart. Edward approached, eyes tired, spirit light. I said it, he murmured. Zaid smiled. You didn't say everything, but you said what mattered. Edward nodded slowly. I'm not ready for the whole step, he admitted. But I think I believe it now. All of it. Zaid placed a hand over his heart. Then say it to him, not to us. And Edward walked into the dark, into silence, unsure of his future. But finally sure of one thing: he could no longer pretend not to see the truth. The first thing Edward noticed was the silence. It wasn't empty, it was ancient. The kind of stillness that made you aware of your own breathing. He stood at the edge of the Hijaz, where the desert opened like an untouched manuscript beneath a sky scattered with stars. He had told his colleagues it was for field research. He used words like contextual immersion and cultural anthropology. But those were just labels, academic fig leaves. The truth was simpler. He needed to see where Muhammad walked, not as a tourist, not even as a scholar, but as a man whose soul was now whispering what his mind couldn't quiet. He wandered through the old quarters of Medina, through narrow alleyways that smelled of dates and dust. At the Prophet's mosque, he didn't enter. He stood outside, watching worshippers flow in and out like a tide pulled by faith. Some wept, others smiled. All carried something he still didn't. Peace. Later in Mecca, he avoided the main roads. Instead, he drifted through the hills, touching the rocks with the fingers of someone trying to connect a story to the soil. He sat alone by a ridge overlooking the valley, the Kaaba barely visible in the distance. Pilgrims circled it like hearts orbiting a center they could feel but not explain. That night, he returned to a small guest house outside the city. He didn't turn on the lights. He sat by the window, Qur'an in lap, Sirah open beside it, reading the same line again and again. If they placed the sun in my right hand and the moon in my left, I would not abandon this message. It wasn't a metaphor anymore. It was a man's refusal to sell out truth even when offered everything. Edward whispered, "Who turns down kingship, wealth, security?" For exile, he turned the page and read about the prophet weeping for his people, about him standing alone in prayer when all had abandoned him, about him giving away what little he had to the poor, while still being mocked as a deceiver. This wasn't the profile of a manipulator. It wasn't even the profile of a typical leader. It was the profile of someone carrying something far heavier than power. Revelation. And that's when it happened. Not lightning, not tears, just a quiet collapse. Edward leaned forward in the moonlight, elbows on knees, and whispered to no one in particular, "I don't think you were lying." His voice trembled. He closed the Qur'an, placed a hand over it, and bowed his head. "I think I was." He had spent years interrogating the text, examining the traditions, challenging every verse. But now none of that mattered. Not the debates, not the university politics, not the unwritten manuscript still waiting in his laptop. All that remained was surrender. But he didn't know how. He looked up at the stars, clearer here than anywhere he'd ever been. Somewhere beneath that sky, Muhammad had walked. Not as a legend, but as a man who wept, bled, loved, feared, hoped, and obeyed. And here he was 14 centuries later in the same land, saying the only prayer he could form: God, if this is the truth, I won't fight it anymore. No one heard it, but the silence responded, not with a sound, but with a feeling, like a burden lifting, like a soul exhaling. That night, Edward didn't sleep. He didn't want to. He stayed near the window, Qur'an beside him, heart cracked wide open, not by argument, but by honesty. For years, he had thought belief was a kind of blindness. Now he saw it was the first time he'd opened his eyes. Edward Langston returned to his university the way a man returns from war, not victorious, not defeated, but changed. He walked past the same lecture halls that once echoed with his critiques, the same offices where his colleagues had toasted his publications. But now everything felt quieter. Not because the building had changed, but because he had. He sat in his office surrounded by his life's work volumes. He had spent decades curating each one, categorized, annotated, and cross-referenced. But for the first time, they felt weightless, decorative, as if they had been answers to the wrong question. The manuscript he had once promised, the one titled The Historical Muhammad, a Critical Deconstruction, still sat on his desktop. He opened it briefly, scrolled through the early chapters, filled with skepticism and sharp analysis, then closed it for good. Instead, he opened a new document. He titled it, What I Couldn't Refute. He began to write not with the tone of an expert, but with the humility of a man who had run out of excuses. I came to critique a prophet. I found a man who feared for his people more than he feared for himself. I expected myth. I found memory. He wrote without breaks for hours until the sun shifted across the floor and the office lights turned warm. Later that week, he spotted Zaid Noor sitting alone outside the library, a book in his lap, head bowed slightly in reflection. Edward approached slowly. "I never said thank you," he said. Zaid looked up, smiling softly. "You weren't ready to." Edward sat down beside him. "I'm still not entirely there," he admitted. "But something's broken, or healed. Maybe both." Zaid nodded. "Sometimes that's what the truth does. It doesn't land like thunder. It arrives like a whisper and stays." They sat in silence for a moment. Then Edward spoke again. "I haven't said the words yet, but I believe them. I believe he was who he said he was." Zaid looked over gently. "Then say it, not to me, not to anyone else. Say it to the one who already knows." Edward hesitated. "I'm not ready to be seen like that." "Not yet." Zaid didn't push. "Then don't be seen. Just be sincere. Faith doesn't need an audience." That night back in his apartment, Edward washed his hands and face. Not ritualistically, just instinctively. He laid out a towel on the floor, opened the Qur'an to a verse he had once dismissed. Indeed, this Qur'an guides to that which is most upright. 17:9. And then without ceremony or fear, he whispered, "God, I believe." There was no lightning, no tears, just stillness, a strange and beautiful stillness that filled the room like sunlight in a cave. The next day, Edward began withdrawing from speaking engagements, politely declined a book award, ignored several interview requests from journalists who had heard of his unexpected remarks at the symposium. He wasn't interested in headlines. He was interested in quiet, in the things that spoke without noise. He began each morning reading a page of Qur'an, not for analysis, but for nourishment. He listened to the adhan online. He practiced pronunciation. He searched for the rhythm of prayer, not in sound, but in surrender. He didn't tell anyone yet, not his colleagues, not his students, not his family. But the transformation was visible in his tone, in his silence, in the absence of sarcasm that once defined him. He had not yet taken the final step, but he was walking. And now he wasn't walking toward argument or academic victory. He was walking toward a door he had once tried to disprove, only to find it had always been open. The masjid was tucked between a small corner cafe and a used bookstore, a modest building with no minaret, no grand dome, just a wooden door and the faint smell of sandalwood drifting into the evening air. Dr. Edward Langston stood across the street watching. He had passed this place for years without noticing. Dozens of times he had walked by books under his arm, journal in hand, wrapped in a world of theory and skepticism. And yet tonight it felt like the center of everything he had ever sought. It wasn't the building. It was what it represented: submission, not in weakness, but in peace. Inside, the Maghrib prayer had just ended. The murmured dua of a small congregation lingered in the silence. Shoes lined the wall. The soft rustle of robes and whispered greetings filled the air. Edward stepped in quietly. No one turned to stare. A few nodded gently. One brother offered a smile of welcome. They had heard of him, of course. Some had followed his story, others hadn't. But none of that mattered here. Not now. He stood near the back until the imam, a kind-eyed man named Imam Salim, approached him softly. "Are you ready, Dr. Langston?" the imam asked. Edward hesitated. His heart pounded. His hands trembled slightly. Not from fear, but from the weight of what was coming. He nodded. Imam Salim gestured for the small crowd to gather. A few brothers drew closer, creating a half circle of warmth and anticipation. Nothing formal, no ceremony, just presence. Edward looked at them, at the men whose lives he once thought were shaped by myth. Men he now saw as followers of a truth he had nearly missed. The imam leaned in gently. "Repeat after me." And then slowly, clearly, with a cracked voice but firm intention, Edward spoke the words, "Ashhadu alla ilaha illallah, wa ashhadu anna Muhammadan Rasulullah." I bear witness that there is no God but Allah, and I bear witness that Muhammad is the messenger of Allah. The room exhaled. Soft Allahu Akbar followed quiet, sincere. One of the elders embraced him. Another placed a hand on his shoulder and said, "Welcome home, brother." Edward smiled, but his eyes filled. Not with confusion, not with relief, with peace. He had spent decades chasing knowledge, mastering arguments, battling worldviews. But none of those pursuits had given him this feeling, this stillness. He sat down on the prayer rug, his breathing slow, his palms resting on his knees. He stared at the ground for a long while until Zaid Noor appeared beside him. "You said it," Zaid whispered. Edward nodded. "I did, and you meant it. I've never meant anything more." They sat in silence, shoulder to shoulder. Later that night, back in his apartment, Edward opened his laptop not to check email, not to revise a manuscript, but to write one final reflection. He posted it to a quiet corner of the internet. No headlines, no press release, just a blog post titled, "The Historian Who Was Defeated by History." He wrote, "I came to critique a prophet. I found a man who changed the world with nothing but truth. I tried to break his legacy with my intellect. Instead, he broke my arrogance with his mercy." At the end, he quoted the verse that had started it all, the one that dared him to read with sincerity. "Do they not reflect upon the Qur'an? Had it been from other than Allah, they would have found much contradiction." Qur'an 482. He closed his laptop, picked up the Qur'an, sat with it like an old friend, and when he whispered the name Muhammad that night, he did not whisper as a scholar, he whispered as a servant. As someone who had finally, after a lifetime of resisting, bowed not to tradition, but to truth. In a world where knowledge often breeds arrogance, Dr. Edward Langston's journey reminds us that truth isn't something we conquer, it's something we surrender to. He came armed with facts, credentials, and skepticism, prepared to dismantle a man he didn't believe existed. But instead, he found a life too sincere to be fabricated and a message too pure to be dismissed. The lesson is timeless. Truth doesn't fear investigation, it welcomes it, but it requires humility to see it. Sometimes the most intelligent minds are the last to submit, not because they lack understanding, but because they confuse doubt with strength. But real strength is admitting when your heart sees what your pride tried to silence. You don't lose yourself by submitting to truth. You lose your ego and find your soul. Because in the end, it's not how much you know that saves you. It's what you're willing to believe when the evidence points to God.